This is a longer video that has to do with, as this title slide suggests, how do we write paragraphs, and then how do we integrate and document sources within those paragraphs. My example essay comes from chapter 6 in our textbook, Melanie Tannenbaum's essay on sexism, because she uses some very long quotations in there, and I thought I'd show you kind of how it works. In addition to this, of course, there is the appendix in our textbook, which covers a variety of topics, including finding, integrating, and documenting sources. It's extremely well laid out. It also includes how to do MLA and how to do APA documentation. Ask me if you're interested in using APA documentation, which is far more common than MLA in academic disciplines. If you bought your book through the bookstore, you should have gotten a copy of something called Easy Writer with it. It was a package deal. Easy Writer is a little short green handbook, and I think it's part 5 is devoted to integrating sources and documenting sources in a variety of different documentation styles. So those are 2 guides that you can look to as well. The first thing I want to talk about is paragraphs, and why do we even have paragraphs? Paragraphs are a relatively recent invention. They don't go back to the very beginnings of writing history, as some other things do, but they've always been chunks of text that have been indicated in some special way. As you can see, centuries ago, we used to use a slash or a dash or a little hook symbol that looked like a upside down fishing hook. The indent was created in the 15th century, about the same time as we invented printing, movable type printing by Johannes Gutenberg. The idea of a paragraph is to make life easier for the audience. You're chunking information into logical piles of connected sentences about a topic so that the audience can figure out what the connections are that you're trying to establish. There's no rules for length. The only rule for a paragraph is that it has to be indented. And even that is not a hard and fast rule. But I think if we know a little bit about paragraphs and how they work, then perhaps we can have some ideas about how to make the documentation of source material work more economically. I'm going to be introducing you to a thing called Triac later in the video that might help you explain a little bit about paragraphs. Okay, here's some early pieces of writing. On the left-hand side of the page is the manuscript for Beowulf, the great Anglo-Saxon poem. Paper was very expensive in this time period. In fact, paper as we know it today didn't exist. What you're looking at here is something written by hand on vellum, which is a processed piece of sheepskin. Sometimes you'll hear old-timers like me call college diplomas sheepskins, and that comes from the practice in the 18th, 19th centuries that they were printed actually on vellum, which is still a product you can buy. In fact, my college diploma from 1973 is printed on vellum. But the thing I want you to notice here is there's no paragraphs and there's only one punctuation mark. You can see just a period here, and there is a period here, and that's it. Everything else is just run together. It's run together because of the cost of vellum. It was a tremendous amount of trouble to make, and so they tried to cram as much as they could on every page. Sometimes they would even erase all of this and then write over the top of it. And what that is called is a palimpsest, where we can see both the original writing, the impression of the original writing, and then what's been written over the top of it. Bottom line, over here, 6th, 7th century, paragraphs didn't exist. Over here on the right-hand side is an English book that was published in 1550, about 70 years after the invention of movable type by Gutenberg in Germany. And you can see the paragraphs, the little indentations here, 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 and so on. Some of these are quite lengthy. And you'll also notice something else, that what we call little marginalia or marginal notes here. They couldn't figure out how to put a heading into the space here of this 2-column printing. It was set up in what's called a matrix, where you have a series of lines that are blocked out by wood, and in between those little lines or pieces of wood is where you'd lay this type, and it was printed, it was laid out backwards so that the impression would show up in the positive, the way that you see it on the page. But they did figure out how to put a little strip of wood along the side and put some little tiny type into those spaces, and these are like little topic indicators or subheadings for the paragraphs. Okay, but you can see the difference. No paragraphs, 7th century. By the early 16th century, paragraphs were quite common. Here's the shortest paragraph I know. This comes from a Eudora Welty essay called The Little Store, and it's 2 words. And I always challenge students to see if you can write a 2-word paragraph in your papers. It's a transition between what her mother says in this paragraph and what she's doing in the next and subsequent paragraphs. So it's a transition that marks the difference between her mother's voice, her mother's thinking, and her own. Okay. Try this. It's more difficult than you think. What I want to talk about in this video is something called the Triac Model, and this comes from a gentleman named Chris Anderson. He wrote a book called Freestyle in 1992 where he proposed this notion of how paragraphs work. And he doesn't look at a specific number of sentences, but he looks at sentence types, and he looks at what is the function of a sentence in a paragraph. And he came up with 5 different kinds. The idea is that every paragraph has some kind of a thesis or a topic sentence. Some paragraphs contain what he calls an R sentence, a restatement or a restriction of the topic. Other sentences include information sentences, and this is something I want you to remember for your explaining concepts papers. Your sources, information from your sources about your topic, is going to go largely in these information sentences. And information sentences, things that you get from your sources, naturally require some kind of documentation. Analysis is the 4th kind of sentence, and this is your analysis, your explanation of why a particular piece of information is there, why you've chosen to include it, what does it mean, how does it move to the next idea that you're going to have, and how does it support what you've already said, and so on. And then his 5th sentence type is what he calls a C sentence. He calls them conclusions because they're usually at the end, but it's not necessarily a conclusion sentence. It could be a transition, like that little Eudora Welty paragraph that we saw. It could just be the last sentence, and it could be time to move on to something else. I'll show you how this works in some of the sample paragraphs in our textbook here in a minute. Things to think about. Most paragraphs don't contain all 5. Body paragraphs, the main body, the famous main body of your essay, might contain topic sentences, information sentences, and analysis sentences. If you have a transition or a summary paragraph, and there are a couple of examples of that in the essays in our textbook, those might contain a topic sentence, they might have some information, or sometimes they might just be analysis and then what he calls, again, a C sentence, something that just stops one paragraph and moves us to the next. Again, this is not a hard and fast set of rules where a paragraph has to contain all 5. Some paragraphs could be entirely information sentences followed by a paragraph that's entirely analysis of that information that explains what it means. But again, you got to think about what's the higher purpose of paragraphs, not just to make your life miserable, but it's meant to help you organize information in a way that your audience can apprehend quicker and faster and easier. Something else to think about is balancing information and analysis sentences. A lot of times we'll have a lot of information. Students will put a quotation, a long block quotation into a paper, and they'll just stop. They won't say, well, what does this mean? Why is it there? How does this connect to the ideas that went before it and the ideas that went after? How does this set me up for what comes next? So a Chris Anderson rule that I think is a good one is that all the information sentences require some kind of or analysis sentences, but it doesn't have to be equal. You could have 5 sentences that are information, that's a quotation perhaps from a source, and then you could have 2 or 3 sentences or 8 sentences or whatever number you need that explains, again, why you've chosen to put that long quotation in there, what that information does in helping you carry out the mission of your paper. There are some issues that come up with these topics of integrating sources. And this is one that's very common with students, is to say, when do I quote, when do I summarize, when do I paraphrase? And then the larger questions that they ask are, well, how do I document it? Where do I get to say me, what I think? And then how do I begin and end a paper? And so I'll talk about each of these things in turn.